Coming up this time, remarkable new research from the Kingdom of the Shu in China. Martyn tries trowelling, and there's more of your questions.
It's all to come on the Time Team podcast.
Yes, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Time Team podcast. And thanks for all the lovely feedback we've been getting. This came in from Patreon supporter Jess Muse about our last episode. Loved listening on my commute to work this morning. I so appreciate how Time Team has embraced the important role that a metal detector and detectorist can play in an archaeological investigation. Anyway, thank you for everything you all do.
Oh, that's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really nice, isn't it? Thank you so much for that, Jess. That's really lovely. And for all the lovely comments we've been getting.
A word from me, actually, that if you are enjoying the podcast, then do give us a rating and leave us a nice comment. If that's something you're able to do in whatever way you're listening to the podcast. 5 stars, I would say, would be lovely, and it really helps us out.
Yes, more from Patreon supporters later in the podcast, because we've had some great questions which I'll be tackling towards the end of the episode. Also coming up, you'll learn the perfect trowelling technique for excavating your own trench. There's the final part of our interview with Time Team's creator Tim Taylor, and I'll be answering more of your questions.
Yeah, talking of questions, actually, Helen, I've got one for you now, because I was reading, and I can't remember when this was, maybe a few days ago, Hadrian's Wall. There's been some really exciting announcements coming out of there, and I wondered what your thoughts were on it. Have you seen this amazing thing that they've discovered?
Yes. Now, this amazing thing, I can't help thinking that it might be something to do with the release of a new Gladiators film, because this is a knife handle in the shape of a gladiator. Although it's a perfect little statue, little bronze copper alloy statue of a gladiator, what he's standing on has got a little slit in the back, a slot might be a better word for it, in the back, which has got iron corrosion in. And so we're pretty sure that it's the handle for something like a folding knife where the iron blade is hinged to clip back into that slot. They're pretty rare finds, and having one depicting a gladiator, well, as far as I know, that's unique. It's interesting that they've released the news now, because it was actually found over 20 years ago, and it was recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database 20 years ago. Yeah, it was all part of this huge amount of finds from, it's the Pierce Bridge project, it's known as, and there was a Roman bridge going across the river at Pierce Bridge, just near Corbridge. It wasn't normal detecting that found all these things, because they were literally found in the river. It's some kind of underwater metal detector. But they spent ages and ages diving in this river at the site of the Roman bridge and found the most extraordinary haul of stuff. It seems that people were standing on the bridge throwing things off, standing on the banks probably, hurling things in, and they're all really interesting and really extraordinary things. And this gladiator folding knife handle is one of them.
That's interesting what you say, though, that they actually discovered this 20 years ago. So are we saying that there's a little bit of sort of, we've known about this for a while, but it just so happens we're probably going to get a bit of publicity because the Gladiator film is coming out, and so we can say, oh, look what we found. I think a lot of people will have read those news articles about this find and have thought, oh, they've just found it just now. But actually, no, they've known about it for quite some time. There must be loads of other objects that are similar to that then, that they've just got hidden away, waiting for the perfect time to tell us about them.
Yes, well, there are 1.7 million objects recorded on the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. And so we can't always treat every single one with the respect and the publicity that it deserves. Sometimes just too much comes in at once. I expect there'll be other things that we see from Pierce Bridge that come into the news because English Heritage really want people to visit. Not only is Hadrian's Wall an extraordinary place, Corbridge is amazing, and the finds are incredible.
It is a remarkable place to go and see. If you haven't been before, I would recommend it. Let's move on then now, Helen, because Time Team is no stranger to carrying out archaeology in exotic locations. I mean, Helen, what's the furthest place away that you've been to do archaeology?
Ooh, I did a lot of survey on Lundy, which is a tiny speck of granite out in the Bristol Channel, 11 miles from the nearest coast. Once you get there, you are completely away. There's no cars. There's hardly any communication with the outside world. The electricity goes off at midnight. That's possibly one of my most far-flung places.
Okay, well that is certainly remote, even though it is only 11 miles away from the mainland. But I see what you mean. It's remote in terms of you are cut off from the outside world. And this is the thing, isn't there? Because there is such a rich treasure trove of finds here in the UK. I mean, there we are just talking about what they found at Hadrian's Wall. It's so easy to get preoccupied with what's here on your doorstep in the UK when there's a whole world of history to unearth.
Yes, in the last episode we briefly talked about that amazing Mayan city which was found, by accident almost in Mexico. And now we'd like to tell you about some work that archaeologists are doing in China, where analysis of over 1,000 bronze objects, some absolutely enormous, and some jade artefacts originally discovered in the 1920s. They're only just starting to reveal new secrets about the people of Sanxingdui in the western Sichuan province, in the kingdom of the Shu. Now, that's a very remote and very mysterious kingdom, and it's thought that they were buried in mounds near the wall of an ancient Bronze Age city.
Let's find out more now from Ling Xin, who is from Archaeology Magazine in the US. Really, really great to have you on, Ling. Thank you so much. And I've been looking at the photos of this. They are so amazing. We'll get to these bronzes in a moment. But can you just set the scene a little bit here? What was going on in that region of China during the Bronze Age?
So Sanxingdui, when it was first discovered about 100 years ago, it was a big surprise because western part of China, about 3,000 years ago, was considered a remote and isolated place. When those delicate, highly advanced jade and bronze objects were first discovered, people, started to wonder, what is this? Is this part of the Chinese civilization at all? Is it just something else?
Because they were completely unlike anything else that had ever been discovered, weren't they? These bronze objects. Can you tell us what they looked like? Give us some kind of idea.
The Han people in the Central Plains, where, the Chinese civilization is thought to be centered around, when they make bronze, they make basically containers. But Sanxingdui here, we see actually images far beyond just containers. We see masks, human faces, or animal images, or, animals that just doesn't resemble anything that we know from the natural world, full of imagination.
Yes, when I saw them, I thought, gosh, that's so amazing. They do not look like any animal you could ever imagine. They're kind of hybrids, aren't they? And that's actually quite similar to the way that the Anglo-Saxons draw their animals on metal. They have odd combinations and you can never really say, oh, that's a dog or that's a wolf or that's a dragon or anything. They're just mixtures of everything. But then I'm really used to this because that's the way we I suppose, living on a small island where everybody has to come by sea, there's a limit to the number of influences you can have. Whereas China is so huge. There are so many places where civilization could think up its own way of being totally different to anybody else. And how old are these things? Because that's another thing that makes me wonder about how easy it is to be completely different. How easy is it to be completely of yourself in a civilization? It's presumably easier the older it is and the less communications there are.
Okay, so according to the excavation team, they were able to do accurate dating this time. They turned out to be around 1000 BC. Somewhere between 1000 and 1010 BC. So that's about 3,000 years ago from now.
Yeah, so that's pretty much our Middle Bronze Age, which is really remarkable, isn't it? Because that's just when we're producing an awful lot of bronze as well, but not on the scale of what's going on here. I mean, there's other actually tons, there's pounds and pounds and pounds of bronze objects buried in these huge pits, aren't there?
Yes, it's really mysterious because it could be like almost all the fortune that the society had at the time. And why did they need to destroy them and bury them?
Yes, it's a real mystery, isn't it?
A real mystery. The intricacy as well of some of these objects are incredible. What do we know now about what life must have been like for the people who owned these objects?
Not much is known, but this much we know. They were growing rice. We can find traces of rice in the ashes, and I think that they grew bamboos as well because there was a significant amount of bamboo in the ashes as well.
Yes, that's where they got their carbon dating from, isn't it? The ash of the bamboo.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right. They were also doing fishing, and also there were significant silk. There were silk manufacturing. There was a wood box in one of the pits, and they definitely have silk remains in the box. It's just really a shame that they were not able to retrieve it because the weather in the Sichuan area is really humid.
It's really amazing that anything can survive in that kind of climate and also so close to the river.
One similarity between all these different pits were, these things were buried in layers. So it was done in an organized way. An organized crime. So at the bottom of the pits, they would bury all these big items. And then on top of that lays a layer of elephant tusks. And then on top of that, there were ashes. I think some of the historians would tell you, the elephant tusks were there, as a symbol to guard the bronze. Although they were broken, they were damaged and buried, they were still respected.
That makes it even more extraordinary that a valuable material like ivory is also in there. And I suppose you can do quite a lot with ivory, given that it's comes from a living elephant. Things like isotope analysis, which I don't know whether they've done yet, but potentially you could find out where those animals grew up.
One archaeologist from Harvard University told me it was really, he was really surprising to see so many elephant tusks there. The elephants, they were mainly distributed in the Yunnan area, which is not very close to Sichuan. So how did these elephant tusks ever got there?
What seems to amaze me is that we have so much information. We have so much stuff to interrogate, yet there are still so many quite basic questions that we don't know the answer to about the lives that these people must have had. And I guess that's a lot to do with how isolated that region has always been. What happens next now, Ling? Where do the investigations go from here to learn even more as technology improves, etc.?
It's a shame that they still haven't found any written language. That is really, really difficult. I heard one of the major goals in this series of excavation, one of their major goals was to look for written language. There was just nothing.
As archaeologists, we don't mind that because it's the historian's job to look at the written record. So we're quite happy with all the stratigraphy and all the objects and all the features. If you begin to pull the threads and unpick it, you can begin to get some tiny little bit of understanding as to what was the motivation to do this. Perhaps it must have been a really enormous thing because this represents a massive amount of wealth.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ling. Really, really great to talk to you.
Thank you.
One of the things we like to do on the Time Team podcast is give you the skills you might need to become an archaeologist. Martyn's been thrown in at the deep end, learning how to read maps, interpret LiDAR data, drive that massive digger, and operate a metal detector. But this time, he's learning one of the first and most important skills you get taught as an archaeologist, trowelling.
Yeah, and you pride yourself on your trowelling technique, don't you, Helen?
Well, I think all archaeologists do to a certain extent. I learnt to trowel on sand. Now, that's really quite easy to trowel beautifully. Gravel, some people say, is the most difficult because you just can't produce a flat surface. And then something like chalk or clay, something hard, that can really play havoc with your arm muscles. But really, it's kind of like icing a cake, soft icing is really easy to get a really good finish, but hard icing, well, that's really, really difficult. But anyway, enough of icing, it's time to find out how it's done.
So I'm Martyn Williams from Time Team. I'm one of their archaeologists, and I'm currently crouching down in quite a large trench, scraping away with my trowel. Though usually to open a trench like this size, in fact I think they did use one here before I got here, you would use a digger. So you would get in your big mechanical digger, your JCB, whatever you want to call it, and you would scrape off the topsoil and the turf with that. This trench is slightly different because I think once we'd got down through the turf, we immediately started using trowels, which is a very delicate way of digging. It's very slow, but you do get very good what we call fines retrieval. You get all the fines, basically. You don't miss anything. There's a general rule when you're digging a trench. The bigger the tool, and in that I include machines and diggers, the quicker you are, but the less stuff you find. So you've got to judge very carefully what you're going to use. So you usually start off in the top stuff with your big diggers and stuff, and then as you get lower and lower towards the archaeology, what we call the archaeology horizon, where all the good stuff is, that's when you get down on your knees and start getting your trowel out. And then if you're really delicate, you get out a little scalpel-y thing or a brush or something like that, and so you can use that to go around bones or delicate cremations or something like that.
It's almost like the technique you might use when painting a wall. Start with a big brush and gets slowly smaller.
Exactly. That's it. Though when painting a wall, I do find that the really small fiddly bits are really, really annoying. But when you're in a trench, the small fiddly bits are sometimes the most interesting bits.
You've got the trowel in your hand. What's the actual technique then for troweling? Because you talked about troweling, but how do you actually do it?
Well, okay, so we use a plasterer's trowel, which is a flat kind of pointy one. The classic is a kind of 3.5 inch, which is quite small really. I think it's the smallest type you can get. And you put it on the ground, generally with the long flat side facing downwards, and you just scrape forwards towards you like that. And short strokes as well. If you do long strokes and you catch a stone or something, you can make a bit of a mess. So it's a bit like kind of, you're kind of like trying to peel stuff off, basically, or scrape stuff off. Going back to the painting, it's a little bit like, imagine some really annoying paint on a wall and you've got to scrape it off with the side of a trowel. It's a bit like that. Of course, things change all the time. I'm currently on sand, which is very, very soft, and it's got lots of stones in it, which makes it a bit difficult because the trowel goes through the sand very easily, and if you hit a stone, it pings off and makes a little mark. So it's a bit tricky here. But there's all manner of different trowels and tools you can use.
The weather must be a big factor in how you do the troweling and the archaeology. We're very lucky today, beautiful weather, and the ground is very dry. If we were in the middle of winter and it was bucketing it down and there was a lot of sort of mud, how would you excavate a site differently?
If it's really raining, you've just got to stop. There's nothing you can do because the rain kind of washes away the surface and it can ruin what you're doing as well. So the more you try and dig it, the worse it gets. And so if it's really raining, you've just got to kind of go back into the tea tent and have a cup of tea basically and wait for it to pass. Try and find something useful to do. Once the rain has finished, that's when the hard work starts because you've got to go out and kind of scrape off all the mud because you end up with this kind of muddy silt across the site. It's not very pleasant at all. Though I have done it many, many times in my life. Done it many times on Time Team actually as well. Interesting what you said about the sun though. It is dried out here, but the dryness makes it really difficult to see what's going on. So the best thing to do is a bit of light, gentle rain. And so at this site, we have the Bowser over there with the big hose, and every now and then we give the site a soaking, really. Not enough to make any puddles on it or make any kind of horrible silty stuff you've got to clean up, but it freshens it all up, and it looks lovely, and you can see what you're doing there.
Time Team is all about getting volunteers involved, and I know there are a lot of volunteer archaeologists that turn up on several digs that Time Team does. What would your advice be to somebody who's maybe never dug a trench before, doing it for the first time as a volunteer, and obviously wants to get it right?
Well, it's quite tricky. I think the main thing is just have a bit of patience. All sites are different. Some sites are more difficult to trowel than others, and just focus on it. You can almost kind of zen out sometimes when you're troweling. I think there might be an expectation you're going to find something exciting in the first 10 minutes. You won't really. I didn't find anything exciting for the first 10 years, really. So there's always time. Yes, but you've just got to keep it focused and sometimes you've just got to let the trowel guide you, really. Don't kind of hack away at too much, and you'll soon get a feel for it, and your arm and your trowel will start guiding you eventually.
Matt Williams showing Martyn the basics of troweling. I love the sound of troweling. It makes perfect slow radio, doesn't it? All those clinking sounds. Yeah. But
it's
actually,
really quite relaxing.
It is, absolutely. But actually, one of the things that I like best about Matt's explanation is what he said about the size of tool and the speed of work and the amount of information that you get out of it. These are often brought together in something called recovery levels. It's a kind of shorthand so that you know that if a section of ditch was dug at recovery level A, so that's with a machine, with a mechanical digger, you're much less likely to have recovered all the finds than if you dig it at recovery level C, which is coarse troweling. It's a way of knowing how much time and effort went into the work and therefore how much you're likely to get out of it.
I think it gives a really good idea of the sort of attention to detail you need in something which people think might be simple. They watch an archaeologist and you think, well, you're just digging there, aren't you? There is so much more involved in making sure that you don't destroy what it is that you're trying to excavate when you're in there with the trowel. This is the Time Team podcast, and it's Helen Geake and it's Martyn Williams here. Your questions on the way next, by the way, but first, it is the final part now of my conversation with Tim Taylor.
Yes, this has been quite an extensive chat with Time Team's creator, which you've been hearing over the past few weeks. Tim's discussed how the programme started, how Sir Tony Robinson became involved, and some of the biggest challenges faced by the team.
Now, in the final bit of our conversation, though, I wanted to know what the future holds. Before Time Team's rebirth on YouTube and Patreon, the Channel 4 series had to come to an end. But how did that happen?
Television has its own way of sort of eating its own produce, in a sense. We'd been through 4 or 5 commissioning editors. Quite a few people at that stage start looking at a thing and saying, oh, well, it's been going like this for 20 odd years. How can we refresh the brand? The television was beginning to control things slightly more than the archaeology. And I think that was not a particularly easy thing for us. And I think also it was exhausting. We were doing 13 a year. I used to kind of finish filming, come home, pass out for a few days, try and get my washing done, pack my bags, and I was off up to Scotland or somewhere. I mean, it is an exhausting process. People in television want the next show to be even bigger and better and more dangerous and more interesting. There's a push like that. That's a natural part of the way the system works. It became less like the Time Team we'd known, which was Mick and I and Phil and Robin and Carenza wandering down to a site together. At one stage, we had over 70 people on a site. I think Channel 4 had their reasons. I think it could have kept going, but maybe we needed to find new ways of looking at it. And that's certainly what appears to have somehow come out of the undergrowth. You know, suddenly it's about YouTube, it's about worldwide audiences, and it's about doing things exactly the way we want to do them.
Yeah, let's talk about that then. Time Team ended on Channel 4. Then there was a period of a fallow period, if you like. And then Time Team was reborn and it came back thanks to people who supported it on Patreon, people who watch it on YouTube. Were you surprised that there was such an outpouring of love and support for the show and for the archaeology that it does?
Well, not really. Over the whole of time, it still happens today. I can get in a taxi in London and the taxi driver finds out I did Time Team, and that's it. He's making detours to show me sites he thinks we should dig. Many people grew up watching Time Team with their parents. It's that anecdotal references to people who really loved the show and really cared about the show. It struck a chord in people's hearts. And I sort of reached the point where I said, well, look, okay, if you want it brought back backers. We're going to open this site on Patreon, and if you really want to bring it back, then please back us. And bless them, they did. We're now, I think, the 25th biggest Patreon site in the world. And what that means is it gives us enough funds to make 3 programs a year or so. But it enables us to make those programs in exactly the way the archaeologists want. We don't have to go to the commissioning editors at Channel 4 or the BBC or Sky or Discovery or whatever. We can make the decisions we want to make on the basis of archaeology. And that's kind of exciting. We're all still archaeological enthusiasts. And that's shared now by people in about 150 countries worldwide. About 4 million people a month watch a Time Team somewhere in the world for free on YouTube. And kindly, quite a lot of those people decide to come and back us on Patreon, which means we can do other things. We can do what we call expedition crew digs, in which somebody phones us and says, we've just found this remarkable pile of coins in the corner of a field. Would you come and help us see if there's anything there? So we can sometimes send out a small crew to check them out, and maybe that becomes the Time Team of the future.
And the future is where this is going, isn't it? And it's so wonderful to see it reborn, bigger and better than ever, because it has the backing of so many people and you can run it in the way you want. Where do you see Time Team going?
Well, you're asking that question at a very interesting time. We are going to carry on making programs. That's there, and we love doing that, and we'll continue doing it. But we're looking at things like a Time Team Academy, where you can learn about new things in archaeology. We're looking at things like educational materials for kids in schools, the next generation of archaeology. We're looking at ways we can support projects. So over the last year or two, we've been supporting archaeologists in Greece, working with Derek and Lawrence to make some discoveries there. There's a way Time Team, I guess, is looking to give back what we've had from archaeology over the last 30 years or so. And if there's a project we can support by funds or a bit of expertise from one of the members of the team, then we'll also try and do that. And what we're trying to say is, yes, Time Team makes programs, but Time Team also can be used to develop and work with people's excitement and enjoyment of archaeology. And that kind of expanding that belief in archaeology is kind of what I think I'd like Time Team to be doing. It's our legacy, if you like.
That's Time Team's creator Tim Taylor there, and that was really fascinating, wasn't it, Martyn? Because the story of how a television programme comes to an end is one thing, but trying to get it set up again, trying to give it a rebirth is quite another. And I think that I believe that Time Team is the only British television programme that's been brought back by crowdfunding and popular demand. I'm really proud of that, and I didn't know we were the 25th largest Patreon site. That's quite incredible.
Isn't it quite incredible? And I think it's a testament as well to just how much people care about the history of where they're from, if you've been supporting us from the UK, and indeed people around the world who want to contribute to discovery and understanding of our history.
Yes, because around the world we used to get complaints, People used to say, why is everybody able to watch it in Britain and we have to wait 6 months or a year to be able to watch it anywhere else? But now everybody can watch all at once, which I really like. And if you missed the other parts of our interview with Tim Taylor, because there are 4 other bits to listen to, you can find them by catching up on previous episodes of the Time Team podcast.
All right, questions time now on the Time Team podcast. This is your opportunity to ask Helen anything you want. She's the archaeologist. She knows what she's talking about. There's been some great questions so far over our episodes. If you want to submit one, you do need to be a Patreon supporter. I'll go through details of how you can do that a little bit later on. But let's get into these questions now. And we start with a message from Bob Stokes. Hello, Bob. He says, proper handling of removed soil and spoil heaps is what I want to talk about. How do you organise it? Do you sift it before it goes in? Do you sift each shovelful? Do you always sift? How fine is the sort of the sifting screen got to be? Do you do metal detection for each layer? Do you where do you put the spoil heap? I guess there's so many different things that you could possibly do. Bob wants to know, how is it done and why is it done?
Well, this is perilously getting close to spoil heap management, which is the threat given to newbies, really. If your troweling technique is not good enough, you'll be sent to do spoil heap management, moving planks, moving a spoil heap that's been put in the wrong place, tidying up, all of what are thought of as the unskilled jobs. But actually, as Bob has worked out, what happens to your spoil is a really important thing, and it really depends on what you're planning to do with it. I think we're back to the concept of recovery levels, maybe, because at our most basic, if we're just machining off topsoil, sticking it in a heap, looking at the features underneath and then shoving the spoil back into the trench, you don't have to do anything to your spoil, really, because little harm has been done to it. It goes back in the same way as it came out. But equally, you've got very little information coming out of it. Or you can keep each bit of spoil separate, so from different areas of topsoil and from each feature, and you can then sieve it, and you can put your clean spoil in a separate spoil heap, and that's another way of doing it. And at that point, you can metal detect as well if it's all in separate areas. Or you can put it into buckets first and then put it through the sieve, and then you put your clean spoil again on the spoil heap. It all depends on how much work you want to do with it, and that depends on what you want to get out of it, what you're expecting. Now, the question about the size of the sieve mesh, there are so many arguments about this. It also depends on what you want to get out of it and also what the soil type is. So dry sand will go through very, very quickly. Wet clay will really not go through at all. It needs to be pushed through with a trowel. And so that depends on your manpower. It depends on whether you think you're going to get anything out of the sieve. It depends on what degree of missing finds you could cope with. Are you okay if you only find half of what's there? Do you want to find 3/4 of what's there? Do you want to find all of what's there? You have to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis. The superstition is that wherever you put your spoil heap, wherever you decide to put it, there will always be the best aspect of the site directly underneath it. So you will always either need to move it or accept that you won't be able to dig that bit. So it's tricky. There's no right answer. As with so much else in archaeology, there's no right answer about how to treat your spoil. Just lots of arguments and lots of wrong answers.
And I suppose the danger is then that you cut so many corners because you want to speed up the archaeology process that you end up missing something and you shove it on a spoil heap, which is why I've seen metal detectorists just sort of whizzing over the spoil heaps just in case there is something in it that they've missed.
Yes, that's the kind of last-ditch belt and braces thing. We also try to get metal detectorists to scan the surface of a feature to warn us that we might be coming up against something. But a lot of the time that slows you down so much because there's something there, and so you go much more slowly, and then you can't find it, and then you call the metal detectorist back and it's still there. And it's always a cost-benefit analysis. You always have to cut your cloth according to your coat. I never quite know the way that goes round. Is it cutting your coat according to your cloth? Well, whatever it is, you always have to do that in archaeology, as in all of life, really.
Well, of course. Bob, a brilliant question. Thank you very much. Let's move on. And this question comes from Lynn Edwards. Thank you, Lynn, for getting in touch. Many times on Time Team, Lynn says, the site has been Roman. The foundations of thick walls have been found, and Phil particularly has said that the building must be 2 or even 3 stories high. So far, so good, says Lynn. But how did the people get to the higher stories? This is a great question. I assume, says Lynn, they used stairs, but I've never seen more than one Roman step that could have led to a higher story. So were the stairs stone or wooden? What evidence of their location and size has been found archaeologically? What should we be looking out for? Presumably, Helen, if we haven't found them, it would mean that the stairs must have been wooden, right? Or am I getting something wrong here?
You've waded into a problem, Martyn, and so has Lynn with her question, which, in fact, we almost didn't even know was there. And that's why Lynn's question is so brilliant, because it's just kind of almost opened a door or gone up a staircase and found a whole new room that we now need to think about. A lot of the time, we've been working on assumptions until somebody asks us a question. We haven't even noticed that those are unquestioned assumptions. I've spent a bit of time this morning having a look through a few general books on Roman buildings to answer this question. And I have found a surprising lack of knowledge. And I'm beginning to think that this could make a good undergraduate dissertation that could be then extended into an MA thesis. And I think there's even scope for a PhD on this. At the moment, yes, this is what happens. The foundations of thick walls have been found, and people say that that building must be 2 or even 3 stories high. And they say, therefore, there must have been stairs. So we're building assumption upon assumption. There are a few Roman stairs that you can see. So if you go to Hadrian's Wall, I keep recommending Hadrian's Wall. If you go to Hadrian's Wall, there are places where you can see stone steps up to the wall walk. There's also places like the Colosseum, say, where clearly you've got to be able to get up to the higher levels, and the steps are in the masonry. So the kind of thing that we're used to seeing from medieval castles and monasteries and churches, where it's all kind of built into the masonry. But Roman villas are not like that. And people have used all sorts of arguments to explain why they're not. They've said things like, well, all the stairs must have been of wood. They've also said we don't have nearly so many, because our Roman buildings are 1,000 years older than our monasteries most of the time. We don't have such good preservation, so we've lost them all. They also look at the fact that buildings are extended sideways a lot and suggest that maybe there aren't as many first floors as we might think. But it all comes down to the evidence, and I don't think that anybody has ever really gathered up the evidence for this. And then I looked in one of my favourite books, which is J.T. Smith. He wrote a book called Roman Villas, A Study in Social Structure. And crucially, J.T. Smith was not an expert in the Roman period. He was an expert in high-status buildings of the 16th and 17th centuries. And he brought a completely different theoretical idea to Roman villas. Roman villas were his hobby. So he came with a completely different mindset. He still only devotes a couple of pages to stairs, but he points out that in all of the villas that he looked at across Europe for his study, he only found evidence of stairs in 3. And that is 2 with stone steps, one's in Spain and one's in Portugal, and one Stanwick in Northamptonshire that has possibly wooden steps. He was thinking about a first floor. I also had a quick look for cellar steps, and there are a few cellars that have wooden steps, but it's something that people always say, oh, they must have had upper rooms because the walls are so thick. But these things where people say, oh, they must have done, I think it would be a really good idea for somebody to look through a whole heap of Roman villas and really, really think about the stairs, because J.T. Smith was covering everything. He only looked at stairs tangentially. But if your whole focus is on stairs, it would be a lovely little research project, wouldn't it? Because you'd actually come out with some new knowledge.
And imagine if you were the one to discover that actually they never bothered with them at all and they just jumped. Or something like that.
Well,
or they had a fireman's pole. That would be great, wouldn't it?
Well, the first book I picked up was by our old friend Guy de la Bédoyère, The Buildings of Roman Britain. And he's put one of his own paintings on the front of that book, I think possibly for for copyright reasons. And up against his beautifully, defiantly 2-story building, there's a ladder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about a ladder. So who knows? See, you could be at the forefront of this research if and Lynn, it was your idea. You'd get a credit as well, I reckon, as part of that. Thank you so much for those wonderful questions. If you have one, we would love to hear from you. You head to patreon.com/timeteamofficial, and if you go there, that is where you need to comment on the post that there will be about this podcast and ask your question there, and we will see it. We have so many as well to get through, but we need more. That is about it for this episode. I have to admit, Helen, I have started thinking a little bit, and I will admit this now, about Christmas. We've got an episode coming out on Christmas Christmas Eve, actually, and I'm already planning something special involving loads of people from Time Team. I will tell you more about it next time. There's a few exciting Patreon-related things to make you aware of. Our Black Friday offer runs until the 2nd of December. You get 16% off annual membership if you're a new Patreon member. If you're already a supporter, by the way, but you do it monthly, you can get the discount if you switch to an annual subscription. Also, if you're in the Digger tier or above, we're giving you, because we're really kind, a one-time voucher code for the shop. That's after the 3rd of December. It's just to say thank you, really, for being a really good egg and supporting the work that we do at Time Team. You can think of it maybe as a little Christmas present from us to you. Oh, and speaking of Christmas, we're also gearing up for the Time Team Festive Feast, an hour-long virtual panel event exclusively for Patreon members. You can put your question to the team live. You can join in the chat. You can hear insights from this year, and there'll be a few teasers for the year ahead too. That is happening in early December.
And I think we're done with this episode. Join us next time for more from the world of archaeology and Time Team. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.